Okay, so to continue this series on parenting, I decided to go right back to the beginning. So this might need a TMI warning. When I had my relationship with my son's father, at the time I lived in Philadelphia and he lived in Brooklyn, New York. Just kind of classic for an avoidant person, that I would be so far away to keep it contained. But in case you're thinking, oh my god, that's like really weird, it was only about 3 hours difference time, to get from my house to his house. And if you're in New York City, you can be going from one part of New York City to another part of New York City and take 3 hours. So, you live in a big city and you just kind of get used to that sort of thing. It was weird, but it wasn't that weird. As a matter of fact, I knew quite a few people who lived in Philadelphia and commuted daily to New York because housing costs were so much cheaper in Philadelphia. Anyway, so what had happened was, first of all, again, we didn't live with each other, weren't married. And then I started getting sick from the pregnancy. I had preeclampsia, had it pretty bad, had to go on bed rest at 3 months out, which was pretty stressful. It was compounded because, see, I don't know how to look at what happened next. Basically, my mother left her husband, and being completely insane, she decided to take her settlement and buy an RV, and she was going to travel the world in her RV. And she got about 100 miles away, and the engine blew in the RV, used RV. And she decided, instead of going back, she wanted to continue this crazy trip, and what she was going to do was come move in with me. And again, I was on bed rest at the time, and again, it's like, I was on bed rest. I could have deliveries and everything else, but I really was not supposed to do anything. I was literally supposed to be in bed all the time. I was also supposed to have as little stress as possible, because preeclampsia, among the things you get is severe high blood pressure. But my mother decided to move in with me, and I was basically out of my mind and under her control. So she convinced me to move into a different apartment, because it was convenient to her. I lived on an upper floor and she had me move to a first floor apartment. Stuff like that. And I just went along with it, which is weird. But again, I was pregnant and I was sick. I was very sick. It wasn't just preeclampsia. I didn't realize how sick I was until after I had the baby. My son was born in October 2001. This was right after 9/11. And so his father couldn't come because he was stuck. New York was seriously still in lockdown at that point. My labor was insane. I have one of those crazy labors that people would never have another kid upon hearing. I only had one kid. I was in labor for 91 hours. And then among the things that happened was, dud this, dud that. I had just terrible luck. My monitor wasn't picking up anything, and they were like, oh, well, we're trying to induce you, because with preeclampsia, you can start seizing if you go along. They induced me a week before my due date, and they gave me so many medications trying to induce me, and the monitor was showing nothing. Now, my mother was there because, she was going to be the grandmother, and she had to be the center of attention. And she kept telling me, oh, stop your whining. It's not even starting anything up. And then finally the doctor was like, you know, you're really reacting to these contractions, and this is showing nothing. And then she came back, put a new monitor on me, and like came bolting into the room, absolutely freaking out because the contractions were off the charts. Huge, massive contraction. She's like, where is this kid? They did a sonogram, and they realized, again, I had a whole bunch of complications. Among them was a corpus luteum cyst, which causes your uterus to just keep, it's what sort of controls somebody's period, and tells the uterus to get, you know, filled up and big, so that, you know, right after you've had your period, to get bigger and bigger. Because I had a cyst, it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. My uterus at the end was about 10 centimeters larger than normal, so it looked like I was carrying either big twins or small triplets with one baby. And at 9 months, he was still swimming around like a 5-month baby. He was not wedged. Usually when you're 9 months, baby's pretty stuck. He was not stuck. And that's the problem. When they started doing the induction, he came down sideways and his head was wedged sideways. When he was finally born, he had bruises on his face from the contractions and trying to give birth. I did have to have an emergency C-section, which was probably a good thing, because with all these drugs that had been in me, they described me as being shredded. That these contractions that I was complaining about, that was, you know, my body ripping itself apart. And I mean, these severe, strong contractions. Oh, that's the other thing, is that I had an incompetent anesthesiologist, and he didn't put the epidural in correctly, so I felt half of my body. The other half, you could have like cut my leg off with a blowtorch. I felt nothing. He just kept adding more meds, and it wasn't placed correctly. So one half I felt everything. Finally, they knocked me out and gave me a C-section, and sewed everything up so that I didn't have to die or have a hysterectomy. And so yeah, so that was that. And then my son got jaundice and had to be readmitted. But when I first went home, of course, my mother was insanely jealous of me getting all the attention for being, you know, having such a terrible pregnancy and birth. And so we were driving home, and I mean, I could barely hold the baby. It was really bad. And she just decided she was too tired to go fill my prescriptions. So that first night, with everything ripped apart, I had no medication at all, because I couldn't take anything because I was nursing a baby. So you can only take like Tylenol, or you can take certain meds. You can't take anything that would really touch it. So it was, she was out first thing in the morning as soon as the pharmacy opened, to get it filled, because then she couldn't stand listening to me in such agony. It was terrible. It was absolutely horrible. And on top of all of this, and despite this awful surgery I had, you know, I had a 3-month maternity leave. And they were like, we're going to fire you, and then when we fire you, you're going to have to pay back the insurance or pay everything. So I went back to work full-time when my son was 3 weeks old, even though I'd had such a terrible surgery. And at that point, I was supporting myself, my son, and my mother. My son's father was like not really interested at that point. I was really boring to him, and babies were really boring to him, and he just decided to move on. My mother stayed in the house until about March, when she got bored, and she just left in the middle of the night. Now, in the meantime, she had been watching my son during the day, of course doing things her own way, not doing it my way, etc. But she just left. So she lived with me for about a year or so, and once she, free rent, everything else, and wreaked havoc on me, and with no notice left, so I had no babysitter, and then I had to, get back to work and everything else. So that was insane. But I did find daycare for him really quick, and that's what basically happened. That was the start. And then we lived totally by ourselves, which you would think, okay, working full time. I was nursing him for the first full year. Even in daycare, I would bring the milk and everything else, and they're like, I get a lot of people, even then, my neighbors in Philadelphia are like, you're doing this totally by yourself. There was exactly one time that I needed another babysitter besides daycare. Absolutely needed a daycare, and I had one of the neighbor ladies, an old lady, watch my son for the day. That was it, one time. I had this super stroller, a Jeep stroller. I would recommend it to anybody. That, first of all, I'm fairly tall, so it was high, so I didn't have to bend over. That's the other thing, is to make sure that, this ergonomic stuff, oh, seriously. I had a really high changing table and everything, because, oh my god, I was not interested in having my back broken by carrying around a 20-pound baby, but, so I had this great stroller that had all these shocks on it and everything else. Also had a huge carriage underneath. So I would use that to go grocery shopping. I didn't have a car. In Philadelphia, you don't need a car. So I didn't have a car. It made it really, really difficult when I was ill from, I had sciatica, and that was because actually at the time, what they said was the baby was growing backward instead of forward, which is true. When I was 6 months along, you could not really see. I looked like I'd gained weight, but I didn't look pregnant at all. He was growing in my back. And so once I took a cab because I couldn't walk from the pain. Other than that, I seriously walked everywhere, even though I was massively pregnant, until I was put on bed rest. And then pretty quickly after I was put on bed rest is when my mother decided that she wanted to get a new life and live the RV life, and ended up moving in with me. In the end, it was extremely convenient to have a car because she had a car and I didn't. And she definitely helped out with, in the beginning anyway, because it's really hard to find infant daycare. So there I lucked out. But then again, it's because they don't accept them until 3 months, and I had to start work at 3 weeks. So if I had had a normal maternity leave and had been able to stay out for 3 months, it would have been a problem. I would have been able to find a daycare, but I don't know. It all worked out. He lived, I lived. The other thing that was insane was they diagnosed me with postpartum depression and sent me to this therapist who, knowing that I was working full-time, had a crazy mother, had a month-old baby, decided that she was going to boot camp me and sent me on to buy these books that were 600 pages long, and wanted me to read both of them the first week before I went to see her the second time. That didn't work. So, I didn't have time for therapy then either. I just sort of put up with it. But that is the very, very beginning of, my adventures in parenthood as a person with avoidant personality disorder.